Hello, assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, and welcome on Youth Matters with me, your host Sakina Habib on Hidayat TV. Now, when we talk about youth empowerment, especially in today's times where we are witnessing so much, youth empowerment becomes very crucial for fostering self belief and active participation amongst our people and within our communities. Now, someone may ask, especially from the youngsters and the youths, that how much important it is to be aware about world politics today, especially with the current ongoing affairs, and what values do we hold as an individual. Awareness of world politics is crucial for today's youth because it fosters active citizenship and empowers us to influence democratic processes. And engaged youth can definitely shape policies that directly affect our lives, such as education and climate change. And, our perspectives bring fresh ideas to political discussion. So, furthermore, understanding political dynamics also helps to combat misinformation, which I feel is very common in these days, where it becomes very difficult to decipher between, the authentic news and the fake news, and which media outlets are we watching to and listening to. Therefore, it becomes very important for us as a public to be well informed, and also it is very critical for a healthy democracy, such that we are witnessing right now, especially in the United States of America. So, as young people increasingly seek alternative forms of participation, such type of social movements are very important in being politically aware about our stance in today's era. Now, today's discussion is going to be very colloquial and very casual. I have a very well renowned, esteemed guest, whom I know is a youth model for many out there. I personally have been watching her for a very long time, and there is lots to learn from her. But more from seeing the professional side of her, I want to tap today into her own self being and into her casual self. And I want to know about how did she get inspired into pursuing a career into politics. And she is going to be taking us into her journey in making us understand about the awareness of authentic world politics today. So without much further ado, I would like to welcome our esteemed guest, Sister Batul Subaiti, who is an energy engineer and also a political analyst. And I would like to welcome her on board. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. How are you doing today?
Wa alaikum salam al ikram. That's very kind of you. Thank you so much, Sakina. Alhamdulillah, I'm doing really well. It's lovely to be with you. Thank you.
The pleasure is all mine. Thank you so much for your precious time. Today, I want a lot of youths to really get to know you and to take a lot of inspirations from your life, inshallah. This is a talk show where we really bring a lot of inspiring models, and we really want our youths to feel empowered and to do something today. So my first question that I would like to begin with is that, Sister Batul, what inspired you to pursue a career in the field of energy engineer and then into political science?
Yeah, thank you so much once again. So yes, in terms of a career in engineering, I think it's really down to the fact that it's quite a mentally stimulating and challenging subject. I was encouraged from quite a young age, I think especially by my father, to kind of always get out of my comfort zone and to think of ways to expand my potential and the tolerance for that as well. So my dad would always remind me of a famous quote in Arabic that says, حبر العلماء خير من دماء الشهداء, which means the ink of a scholar is greater than the blood of a martyr. And he would tell me that here you are being a scholar as an engineer because your knowledge is useful, practical knowledge. It's a form of service for humanity. Whether you're a doctor, an engineer, you're basically providing a useful service. And he always emphasized to me that this education that I was receiving throughout my secondary years at uni, that is really a kind of form of jihad. It's a form of struggle in the way of God, because one of the more difficult things to do is to sit down and to concentrate and to absorb that kind of difficult technical scientific knowledge. So it was never really about choosing that easier or more comfortable subject. That's kind of how my dad, inspired me growing up. And I never personally viewed the value of, having a 9-to-5 job, which is essentially my career right now. It's an engineering job. I never really viewed it from the lens of, it being this kind of financial stream. It was always from the lens of, I want to develop useful skills. And I think the mental abilities are probably of the most important skills you can get in such a job. And I think also maybe from a more technical perspective, these are essential skills that we can employ back home, to develop our home countries. So that's always also been in the back of my mind, for the more distant future, if you will. I think in terms of politics, again, from a young age, my father instilled within us this understanding that politics and religion are basically inseparable. A Muslim has to be involved with the, issues of the day, has to understand how the world works, has a duty, essentially, an effective duty as a Muslim to clarify the truth, to expose falsehood. A Muslim should carry Islam on their shoulders in the real sense of it manifesting with everyday issues. I also went to a Muslim high school when I was around 12, 13. That's when the Arab Spring began. So I was quite young at the time, but I remember all the giving into Western conspiracy that happened, all the shilling for regime change in Syria, the anti-resistance axis sentiment that I would hear. So that was really my first instance of becoming technically interested in reading and understanding the political realities to be able to effectively answer and clarify the real position on matters. So that was a big motivator for me at the time when I was quite young and going into my teenage years. So I think it was actually good that I grew up in an environment where I was challenged with the other narratives that were the more mainstream narratives, because that prompted me to really ask questions. I wasn't in an echo chamber of like-minded people growing up when it pertained to politics. And I think that's quite important when it comes to children, because it's in the nature of children to want to learn when they are challenged, as opposed to being preached at. Challenging incentivizes them to, take it into their hands, to search for themselves, to ask questions. And this naturally continued throughout the years. I think at uni, it reached a point where I felt there was a need to kind of put that close understanding of political events unfolding into writing. So that's when I began, the journey of writing articles for outlets. This was something that I would do in my spare time, speaking where I could, I think wherever the opportunity presented itself, because that was a form of reinforcing and consolidating all of the kind of knowledge that I had accumulated. So that feed in and that feed out. But it's always ultimately come from a sense of Islamic duty more than anything. In the same way that you look at salah, psalm, prayer, fast to be a religious duty, likewise, jihad is one of furu'ad-din, the branches of the faith, and this is the kind of the jihad of speaking with the tongue, effectively.
Absolutely, that's so inspiring. The fact that you go to the 9-to-5 job as an engineer, and it's very difficult for women to basically balance the outside job as well as the home affairs, and the fact that you're doing that, because being an engineer in itself is a very intellectual task. I mean, there's so much that happens. I'm sure you know it better than me. So, mashallah, hats off to you. Also, when it comes to politics, how do you stay informed about global political developments, as you are very much involved and engrossed in your 9-to-5 job?
Challenge, but it's an everyday thing. It's finding pockets during the day where you can kind of look at the news and read it. But effectively looking at different sources of news, I think that's quite important. So you want to look at what the arrogant powers have to say, basically. That's quite an important source. They tend to expose themselves a lot. So I've relied, in this past year on my assessment of the situation. For example, if we take the war on Raza, with effectively what Israeli officials have had to say, whether that's them calling Palestinians human animals, speaking loudly in terms of their genocidal intent, to, expressing their military failures and admitting to the strength of the resistance forces on the ground. So that's important. Another source is, what do the resistance officials have to say? Ultimately, you're looking at those who are leading the battles on the ground. So we should be looking at different outlets. We should be reading from The Atlantic, Foreign Policy, Axios, Haaretz, Times of Israel on one side. And on the other side, we should be reading and looking at, for example, the Resistance News Network, El Mayadeen, Press TV. So you have that kind of, feed in terms of the facts. Then there's the more analytical understanding of political events, so that's another step as well. So what are analysts saying? Those who have experience analyzing the realities on the ground. You have outlets like the Cradle Media that does a great job at that. Al Jazeera also bring quite strong analysts, especially the Arabic one. I'm not too familiar with the English, but investigative journalism, I think, is also important and insightful on another level. So, for example, exploring the way that, Western intelligence systems infiltrate the lives of everyday people, the way that they conduct regime changes and coups, looking at the Israel lobby, how it operates, so you have, again, different outlets that focus on investigative journalism, like Declassified UK, Spinwatch, Electronic Intifada, Mint Press News, Grey Zone. So that's another layer. I would say history also, like knowledge of history is quite important to understand political developments. So the question of really how we got to this point, history contextualizes everything. And ultimately, the question of who runs the world, so book reading is quite important. It's not just, it's easy to get lost in the everyday news, but you kind of want to develop a holistic understanding of the events and the courses as they take action. So I think there's ample information out there. It's just about dedicating time during the day for that feed in. But I would say what's also helpful is, having a feed out of some sort. So, one might want to consider dedicating a social media account to that, because I think retaining information and consolidating it is through going over it, digesting it, writing it. One might even think of starting a book club as an act of motivation, with like-minded people. That helps to generate discussions. You might want to consider starting a podcast if you want to interview insightful people. So there's so much that one can do in terms of feed out that can help consolidate, that political knowledge and its accumulation with time.
You gave a lot of names about a lot of newspapers that are, sorry, news outlets, news sources that we can take our information from to be very authentic. Also, the importance of language, the way in Arabic we say اللغة يعني مهمة جدا, right? So what would you say for, the youths today, in terms of achieving that knowledge of language as well, when it comes to especially politics and journalism? How important would you say is that today?
I mean, political knowledge is very important. Again, that comes from reading from a wide array of sources, and I would say not just sticking to news outlets, but effectively to book reading as well. That is quite important. Reading, for example, the memoirs of former presidents and prime ministers, those who kind of lived within the system internally, is quite insightful as well. But in terms of the actual use of political knowledge, because I did mention some of the outlets that are not pro-resistance. You could call them like the enemy outlets, like the Times of Israel, for example, or even the more mainstream ones, like the BBC, Channel 4, if you will. With those outlets, the assumption is that when you're consuming information from that, you kind of have a base foundation, you have a base understanding of the political reality and events, and so you're not swayed by that. The reason that you would approach these kinds of outlets is to understand what the enemy is saying. For example, that's why I began answering this question by saying, it's good to read about, the memoirs of those who were in positions of power to understand really how the enemy thinks. So once you understand how the establishment thinks and how it operates, then you won't approach, these outlets, these mainstream outlets, from a position of, trying to understand what they say, to form a worldview, but rather to understand, the inherent reality of that injustice. You take that as the premise, and you take that as the base. So you can see through the propaganda, is what I'm trying to say. Because even within political discourse, there's a lot of colonial language. So you'll be able to then pick it up at the instance. For example, one of them is, constantly referring to the region of, West Asia as the Middle East. Not many people think in terms of how that's the kind of colonial construct of, that piece of area in the world being in the Middle East relative to Europe, for example, relative to the West, as opposed to just calling it West Asia. And that's something that actually Sayyid Ali Khamenei emphasized at one point. So I think that the ability to read through that language that you see on mainstream media, that's something that one will naturally understand with time when they have an open mind and heart to be recipient towards the truth, and they're looking at the right sources as the foundational base for their understanding of the world. And then they look at, enemy sources like, the Times of Israel or the rest of it, just to understand what they're saying, as opposed to taking that as the base for understanding the world.
Absolutely. So now, what do you think, what should motivate youths today to stay engaged in the field of political science while maintaining, our spiritual and Islamic values as well? Because I think this is a challenge that comes within, for everybody, including even adults at times. What are your views on this?
I'll start off by saying, if you're not political, you're not really relevant in this world. Even today, the topic that everyone is talking about, is Palestine, Lebanon, Iran, America, the Israeli occupation entity. I mean, these are the main headings, if one just loads their Google page. The embodiment of true Muhammadi Islam is to consider the issues of society to be one's own issues. We see the first thing that Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam did in Medina was establish an Islamic government. And Quraysh had a real issue with the Prophet because, the Islam that he brought forward was one that was transformational. It sought to uproot the evil that was governing and to replace it with a just system. So this is true Islam. God's mission for humanity is to establish justice in society. So every single one of our ma'sumin as well, our infallible imams, we know they sought to establish an Islamic government. They sought to rule by justice, And when they didn't have enough supporters, that's when they focused on building a support base whilst also exposing the truth. So our imams were unwavering when it came to, clarifying the truth, dispelling the lies, exposing the tyrants. Our imams were never passive, and the biggest proof was that, every single one of our imams was shaheed. And, not all of them rose up in armed insurrection because they were unable to, but it was the jihad of the clarification of the truth to the masses that really threatened the superpowers of the time. So this struggle, this jihad of exposing the truth, dispelling the lies, really it's the duty of every Muslim. It's a duty for everyone. In the same way that, praying and fasting is, we know that jihad, as I mentioned, is one of the furu' ad-din, the branches of the faith. And it means to really strive against an enemy, to strive against an opposing force. That's what the term means. So one should, expect to also face resistance in the face of it. All the justice seekers throughout history, didn't have it easy, but God promises us that, وَلَنَبْلُوَنَّكُمْ بِشَيْءٍ مِّنَ الْخَوْفِ وَالْجُوعِ وَنَقْصٍ مِّنَ الْأَمْوَالِ وَالْأَنفُسِ وَالثَّمَرَاتِ, that we will test you with, fear, with loss of wealth, with the loss of, souls, but give glad tidings to those who are steadfast, so I would say that, it's important to also look at the promises of God and understand that this is one of the most foremost duties that we have as Muslims. The importance of the word of truth, can be seen by just looking at the billions and billions of dollars that's spent on the media, spent on controlling the narrative, the emphasis placed on the censorship of the truth. When people wake up, when people demand change, depending on how radical that movement for change is on the ground, that's when those at the top are really forced to accommodate, to make concessions. Where the West has been successful in coups and color revolutions, it's where they've succeeded in colonizing the mind. And where they failed, so for example, we see in the Islamic Republic of Iran, they've sought to do this for the past 4 decades. It's failed because the soft wall hasn't been strong enough to lead it to its success, ultimately. And it was ultimately when the people of Iran understood the truth that they mustered also the courage to rise up and to bring the Shah down as well. So the information narrative is everything. It's so important.
Right. So, as you mentioned, like, there are some soft wars, and then, of course, there are the hard wars. Okay. So, it depends on the situation. But now, I think also the type of war that one witnesses has a different type of impact on an individual. How do you think can one handle the emotional challenges of working with controversial political topics today? So, especially like what we're witnessing today in real time. Um, there's the truth, and then there's news that's being warped, right? So, um, how are we, witnessing this? What do you think? Like, how can we handle the emotional part of it?
Yeah, so I'll begin by saying that I think emotion is what propels us. There's a very famous saying by the Prophet sallallahu alaihi Nabi Muhammad, where he says, "Hal ad-din illa al-hub," is religion anything but love? So religion is an expression of love and emotion. But, if this turns into negative emotion, so defeatism, despair, even materialism, that's of the greatest disease that can inflict the cause of truth and justice. So anchoring ourselves in the promises of God is very important. Reading the Quran daily is important. God promises victory to those who resist, to those who are steadfast. And if we want liberation, if we want freedom, if our slogan is truly Hayhat min adillah, never to humiliation, well, when evil exists and you reject to be enslaved by this evil, there is a price to pay. That freedom won't come for free. But also, it's also true that living under evil, there is also a price being paid there too. So it's like, would you rather get killed as a victim of occupation or as a resistor of occupation? So I think it's important that we understand that. What does free Palestine even mean? How can this be achieved? Can it be achieved by, relying on the UN, for example? UN resolutions only get invoked in times of crisis for Israel. But if, Israel's doing well, the world will not bat an eyelid. So pre-October the 7th, the world didn't bat an eyelid about the Palestinian struggle for justice. You as an oppressed nation have to force that change on the ground. And it's also remembering that victory is of 2 kinds, as the Quran tells us. إحدى الحسنيين. You have the nasr, the victory on the ground, that is promised. That is, if you resist, with God's help, you will be victorious. إن تنصروا الله ينصركم ويثبت أقدامكم. The promise of, كم من فئة قليلة غلبت فئة كثيرة بإذن الله. How many times have a group that's small in number and capabilities triumphed over those who are greater in number and capabilities? So there's that promise, but there's also the victory of martyrdom, so that if you do pass and you do rise in ascension, during this battle, you are a martyr. So you've reached your peak of potential anyways. Martyrdom is the highest potential that you can reach. That's a goal in and of itself. So there's no such thing as loss in this cause and in this road to liberation. Loss has no meaning.
Some of the duties that one holds. You said that there are people who are victims of occupation, and then there are victims of ones who are resisting. Okay, so we are all living in different parts of the world. I mean, there are people who are facing real-time wars, who are there physically, and obviously they feel the situation very realistically, and the pain. And then there are people like us who are watching things on screen, right? Of course there's a difference, like when it comes to feeling something, when you're in the environment and when you're just watching something, right? So what do you think becomes our crucial responsibility today? I mean, for example, it could be me, living over here far from Gaza, from Lebanon. And obviously, we've got our own daily commitments, right? We've got our family, our work, our house chores, and everything. And in amidst all of this, how do I make myself realize that there are ways of contributing to this noble cause? As you said, it becomes a very strong duty for me also to do something. So, like, I want to just give a message to everybody. What can each of us do?
Absolutely. What you say reminds me of the famous hadith of the Prophet where he says, if you see a munkar and evil, the weakest iman is feeling restless in the heart, the heart being disturbed, the heart palpitating in the face of it. But that's the first step ultimately. We can't feel normal during these times. We have to feel restless. We have to feel uncomfortable. That's what propels us to effectively want to do something, to even think about making change. And the second factor is also not letting fear enter our hearts. That's why I focus quite a bit on the aspect of the promises of God, and reiterating that yes, on this path and on this struggle for justice, you might face hardships, that naturally stem from, championing the cause of truth. We know that the jihad is not just the jihad on the battlefield, in terms of fighting, but the actual battlefield, the more important prerequisite to that is the battlefield of the narratives. It's the war of morale. Ultimately, even if you look at the Israeli occupation entity strategy right now, in Lebanon, for example, its strategy of targeting civilians, and in Gaza as well, is to get them to turn against the resistance. In Lebanon, it's to get the people of the regions surrounding the resistance to say, stop supporting Gaza, because once you stop supporting Gaza, we won't be subjected to this criminality and this bombardment. Of course, that's completely not true, because Israel has just, shown its true face to the world, its colonial true face. But that's our intention, is to get the people to the point of despair. So the information narrative is very, very important. As I mentioned, if one looks at the billions of dollars that is spent on just maintaining that narrative, and the real threat that emanates in the form of censorships and clamping down on those who speak the truth. Many activists, in the UK, it's increasingly becoming common for their homes to be raided as part of intimidation tactics. All of that should prove the importance of speaking the word of truth. So that's the second level that the Prophet speaks about in this hadith. He says, to actually raise your voice. And there are many ways that, we can raise our voices as part of our taklif. And I think that is the main taklif for us. Those on the ground, their job is to fight. Our job is to be as, echoes for the voice on the ground, narrating that truth to the world. It's the tabeen that Sayyidah Zainab sallallahu alayha did after Karbala. The stance of Sayyidah Zainab was just as important as the sword of Imam Hussain sallallahu alayhi, because without her tabeen, we wouldn't know about Karbala. It wouldn't be inspiring the movements of today, which is where we take all our strength from. We know that the revolutions of that happened consequently after Karbala, through Al-Mukhtar's movement, through the Tawabun, through the movement of Zayd ibn Ali, to bring down Banu Umayyah, that effectively brought them down. That was all due to the tabeen, the aspects of clarifying the truth. So I think that's the most pressing issue that we have today, every single one of us can consider ourselves journalists, within the capacity that we're able to, within the free time that we have, even if that's just dedicating half an hour or an hour every day. But it's about really feeling, the responsibility of the cause, it's feeling it on our shoulders. And as I mentioned, that contribution can take different shapes and forms, so for those of us who work, it depends where you work. Are you a teacher? You can take up, complaints regarding the curriculum with the National Union of Education, the inherently colonial curriculum that our children are taught in schools. Do you work as part of a corporate company? You can push for divestment. Do you work in the NHS? Likewise, you can push for similarly divestment in the name of, the atrocities that are happening to the healthcare sector in Raza and Lebanon. Are you part of a mosque committee? Are you involved there? You can push to have more speakers to raise more awareness. On an individual capacity, you can utilize social media. You can comment under, mainstream posts. A lot of people, read, for example, I don't know, on Instagram, on Twitter, BBC, Channel 4, whenever their headlines come out and they're blatant propaganda, you can make a clarification at the bottom of it, breaking those propaganda algorithms, calling up radio stations. I mean, there's a lot that one can do if they really put their mind to it, but also supporting direct action. So that's the third step that the Prophet speaks about. You have direct action movements, on the ground today in the West. For example, Palestine Action. They are a movement who smashed the weapons manufacturers in the UK. You're talking about quite a price to pay over here, though. You're talking about arrest, potentially facing prison. But there are other ways to support Palestine Action in the UK and abroad as well that doesn't necessarily involve being arrested by crashing into arms manufacturers. You can support them financially. You can support the court hearings of those who are in court and being trialed, etc. Yeah.
I loved how you connected it to Bibi Zainab, salamullahi alaiha, because indeed it is very true that she was the one, who carried on the legacy forward of Imam Hussain alayhi salam. And, when she said the famous words, Ma ra'aytu illa jamila, I think that implies even today, as you clearly highlighted and mentioned, that, what we're seeing around the world, how people are doing protests like in the UK and in several parts of the world. If this is not that beauty that Bibi Zainab salamullahi alaiha once spoke about, then what is it? That the whole world is coming to realize that, who are the actual tyrants and oppressors, and, everybody is now beginning to awaken to spirituality, and, their conscious levels are finally understanding the fact that what's being done is, incorrect. So inshallah, of course, we hope that, more of this takes place, and, people really are on the right path of haqq, inshallah. It's not easy, because to just say and to do things practically, of course, is pretty challenging. But we pray to Allah that, everybody gets that tawfiq. I would want to ask you personally that, could you share an experience about a political project that deeply resonated with you, and how did you manage to balance objectivity with passion in your political analysis?
Yeah, absolutely. Just before I go into that, I just want to echo your point about beauty. It's very, very true. I think we saw the pinnacle of that with even the pager attacks that happened in Lebanon. You had some brothers who were saying, please, I want to donate my eyes to those who lost their eyes in the pager attack. I want to have a share in the reward, effectively, of supporting our brethren in Gaza. So really, it's seeing humanity reach the peak of its potential through this. So absolutely. In terms of a political project, yes. So me and my family, we've embarked on a project. It's a family project that we've been doing for a few years now, really exploring Hizb Dawa, which is a political party in Iraq, looking at its inception, Our grandfather, so me and my siblings' grandfather, my father's father, he was the shadow man, behind the party, behind its writings, etc. We're talking about the late 50s, 60s, 70s. So this was before the Islamic Revolution in Iran. And this was the case until he was captured in 1980 and martyred in 1988. The Dawah Party now is very different compared to what it was and what the vision was at the start and the inception of it. So in this documentary that we're embarking on, we're uncovering quite a pivotal and sensitive movement. Not much is known about Hizb Dawah in that period due to the real secrecy. It was literally operating underground to the point where most people today don't know who the founding fathers of the party are. And after some time, there were, some false narrations that were attributed to that period. So ultimately, this documentary that we're working on, it comes as part of efforts to correct history, to do justice to it, and to present it as it was with evidence. So yes, it does require a lot of objectivity, even when you hear things that are not true, but there's still testimonies that people have or that people have heard. So we've captured that in the documentary regardless. We don't always sit with those who we agree with, and that hasn't been the case. We've not always sat with those who we agree with 101%, but we document what they have to say and in a way that basically lets the facts speak for themselves, and ultimately that dictating the logic. So the audience will come to understand if they're really interested enough to think deeply about the subject.
So that's an inspiring one. I mean, can you hear me? Can you hear me? Yeah. So that's a very inspiring one. I mean, something to really look forward to. And the fact that you told us about the history, that, how you started it. So that means that you started it from a very long time. And, you've been working on it like till now.
Now since 2019, we've been interviewing quite important individuals. Even 3 individuals that we've interviewed so far have passed away, unfortunately. So yeah, because it's you're talking about a period that was way back, 50s, 60s, 70s. But yeah, it's one of those projects that we just consider a duty, because our father lived during that time. And under my grandfather, so he saw the reality as it unfolded, and when kind of what transpired, it becomes a duty and a responsibility to document that truth. So it comes from that position more than anything.
For its success, inshallah. And I'm wishing you all the very best, inshallah.
Thank you so much.
So we are almost heading towards the end of our program today. The final question for today, which I think is very important. I think this should be a great message and a great source of knowledge for the youths. So if you could just, give us some tips on what key points should one keep in mind when working with individuals holding differing political views. As you mentioned, this is also part of your project that you've been, working on. So it's like you don't just get carried away with what everybody's saying, right? You have to be very careful on what authentic news do you want to, reveal to the people. So, what tips would you advise to the youths today?
Yeah, so when you say differing political views, I'm assuming that there's, a foundational point of unity with those who are holding those differing views. So for example, seeking a world that is free of oppression. It's difficult to converse with those who, cross red lines in terms of political views. So I don't know if someone supports genocide or occupation. I think here we're talking more about those who there is that foundational point of unity, but maybe due to 101 different factors, including ignorance or media propaganda, one can have a not so, correct understanding of what justice looks like, or doesn't have the full picture, essentially. And I would say in those cases, uniting on the common word is important, using that as kind of like a launch pad and a starting point. Presenting the facts, I think the objective reality speaks for itself, without getting too emotional either. So it's really simple. It's not complicated. So for example, someone might want Palestinians to be free from oppression, but yet at the same time, they talk about the two-state solution, or they think that that's a viable solution. It's like talking about the two-state solution makes no sense in this context. Why? Because it's not only a question of, what does justice look like, but, you can clarify to this person that, it's a question of objective reality. Israel itself doesn't believe in Palestine's right to exist. It's predicated on Palestine's extermination. They consider the idea of a Palestinian state to be a suicide. We all saw how the Oslo Accords went. The greatest amount of Palestinian land theft happened during Oslo that was used as a guise and cover for peace. So for example, that's how I would answer someone who is, a well-meaning pro-Palestinian who adopts that two-state solution narrative, within our movement. So I think it's sticking to the presentation of facts, because they will clarify ultimately the realities.
Right. So, as you said, it is very important sometimes to not just follow the crowd. I mean, I think we're seeing three categories. There are those who are completely against the genocide, and of course, they are opposing against this. And then you've got those, who support the genocide, and then you've got the third category who are just silent. They don't care whether the genocide is going on, if people are dying. I mean, we don't have anything to do with it. This matter doesn't concern us. So automatically, this category does fall into the first category, into the second category of those who support the genocide automatically, right? So one needs to be very careful about the decisions that they are making. Um, Anyways, I would like to thank Sister Batul. Thank you so much. I honestly thank you. It has been a pleasure to have you. And I know you are a working person and you've had a long day, and still you took out this precious time for my show. So I'm so thankful to you. And I hope that many of the viewers benefit from today's program. Jazakallahu khairan. Thank you, sister.
All your best efforts. It's my absolute pleasure and honor. It's been a lovely chat. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you to all our viewers for tuning on today's program. It was absolutely and indeed a pleasure to have had Sister Batul with me today. And she has shared a lot of wisdom on today's program with so much. She shared her story, her life story, and then she also explained about the affairs that are the current world affairs that are taking place today, and how one should not just be silent, because that would definitely then make us in that category of those who support the genocide. I would just like to end with a quote, a hadith from Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, who has said that we help the oppressor by stopping him from oppressing others. Sometimes silence is violence. We cannot be silent in these situations, and it is even worse to tell a victim of oppression to be silent. So, with that, I leave you all with this beautiful hadith to think about our duty and our responsibility in today's time and in today's era. And with that, inshallah, I would like to leave you all. And please make sure to like today's program, keep sharing it as much as possible, and look forward to having more upcoming discussions on Youth Matters on Hidayat TV. This is your host, Sakina Habib, signing off. Jazakumullahu khairan. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.